There is no rest for the weary. Following tonight's debate, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders will head to Nevada for several rallies, immediately followed by trips to the Carolinas.
Ahead of those campaign stops, the presidential hopeful will take the stage in Houston and make his case for being the Democratic nominee to the entire nation. Joining us to discuss how he's preparing for tonight's spectacle, I like that we call it that, is the Bernie Sanders campaign National Press Secretary Briahna Joy Gray. Great to see you, Briahna.
It's great to be here.
So take us behind the scenes, if you will, into the senator's process of preparation. Like, what does he do? How do you guys work with him? How does that all unfold?
Well, since the last debate, we have released policy after policy, huge transformative policies, right? We have a criminal justice policy. We have the Workplace Democracy Act, which is all about making it easier for Americans to unionize and actually get the protections that the NLRB are supposed to protect, labor protections that have fallen by the wayside. We've had, and of course, the Green New Deal, right? And we had some of those unpacked, for instance, in the climate debate, or not debate rather, in the town hall last week. But a town hall format where candidate after candidate follows each other and talks about their policies isn't the same thing as being able to actually have a conversation in which you can contrast and compare what people are actually offering on such a critical issue. So I think one of the main things we need to be looking forward to tonight is having a side-by-side juxtaposition of what these candidates actually stand for on these big issues.
So, Briahna, we've seen in many of the debates, the senator hasn't necessarily gone after many of his opponents, but the summer of love is over. It's September. Things are starting to get real. Can we expect him to contrast his policies with other people on the stage?
I think you can absolutely expect that contrast. But whether you characterize that as going after another candidate, I don't know if I would do that, because the reality is Senator Sanders can stand on the merit of his policies. We've seen in debate after debate, the conversation largely revolves around candidates trying to justify how they are like Sanders or explain why they're not like Sanders. Because the reality is the Sanders policy platform is the populist platform that is actually well regarded by overwhelming majorities of Americans.
Absolutely.
How are you all feeling about your poll positioning at this point?
We're feeling really good. We've been strong and consistent throughout this race. Now, the way the media has characterized our standing is that when someone else goes up 2 points and we go up 5 points, they're surging and we're omitted from the headline altogether. But internally, we feel really good about our position. We're doing, much stronger in terms of the number of donations that we've gotten individually from around the country than we were at this point last year, and frankly more than any candidate in American history. We should all remember that when you look at Obama to Trump districts, for instance, there is nobody who has raised more individual donations than Bernie Sanders. And when you look overall, the only candidate in this race who has raised more individual donations than Donald Trump is Bernie Sanders. These are the facts that people need to be looking toward when they're thinking about electability and who is the best candidate to actually take down Trump.
So, Briahna, the way that we see it is it's basically narrowed down to three major candidates if we look at the polling. And so there's an ideological battle between basically return to centrism 2012 with Joe Biden, then there's a progressivism working within the system under Elizabeth Warren, and then political revolution with Bernie Sanders. Why is it that the political revolution is better than the other two?
I think what we saw in 2008 was an extraordinary amount of excitement from the people about Barack Obama's nomination. But what ended up happening is that when that fervor wasn't supported, when the Obama outreach machine was dismantled after he came into office, all of that power of that excitement dissipated. So it is absolutely crucial. He had a House and a Senate behind him and still struggled to implement certain kinds of policies. So if you want to be able to be successful, you need to have a revolution, if you will, that keeps the people engaged. What Bernie Sanders has said is, how am I going to get Mitch McConnell to fall in line? Well, I can go to Kentucky, I can go to his district and get crowds of thousands to stand with me and cheer and say, it is Mitch McConnell who is blocking you from getting the policies that you voted for when you put me in office. It's Mitch McConnell who's ignoring the fact that in this state, one of the poorest districts in this country, he is ignoring what you clearly have articulated are the needs of your community. And we are going to put that pressure on and use the pulpit of the presidency to make sure that politicians across this country on both sides of the aisle actually meet the needs of their constituents. That takes people power. That's what we mean by revolution.
So Biden's team has been telegraphing that they may go after Elizabeth Warren on the grounds of her past work for corporations, legal work for corporations. Do you think that's a fair game?
I think a lot of candidates are going to have to answer for their histories, both in office and before they joined political office. And I think one of the things that I really value about working for the Senator Sanders campaign is that I don't have to worry about that almost at all, really, And so what we have is a candidate who has been in office so long, and yet at the same time doesn't have all of those foibles. What he's known for is being on the right side of history again and again, whether it's about the TPP, whether it's about gay marriage, whether it's about civil rights, and literally being arrested for protesting segregated schools when he was a teenager in college. He's someone whose long history and his longevity is actually a selling point instead of something that you have to excuse. So I'm interested to see, just like you, what the other candidates are going to do on the stage tonight, but I'm very confident that Bernie Sanders is not going to be similarly tripped up.
He never really does get tripped up, does he? I think what's interesting is that we're going to look to see how things play out afterwards. But there's a longevity in the way that a lot of the Sanders people that we talk to speak. So what is it about the long-term strategy going forward, all the way towards Iowa, that Bernie is planning on?
Well, I think first and foremost what we've seen, including in the popularity of other progressive in the race, Elizabeth Warren, is that talking about progressive policies actually does break through. It actually does work. And part of the problem is getting the mainstream media to actually talk about those things. And what we saw last year, the cable news talked about climate change, for instance, a total of about 90 minutes for the entire year. And most of that was concentrated in the last 3 months of the year. Very little coverage actually ties cataclysmic events like hurricanes and the fires that we've seen out west to climate change. So even though this is ranked consistently as a #1 concern of both Republicans and Democrats, 80% of Americans rank climate change as a priority. We don't see coverage of that. So one of our priorities is continuing to use independent media, our own podcasts, and videos that we produce on Bernie Sanders YouTube, to which everybody should subscribe, to continue to spread the message about what we're actually doing in-house, because our policy team is doing extraordinary work to actually do the work of saving this planet. Our Green New Deal isn't just a climate policy. It is a jobs plan that has a provision to create 20 million new jobs and basically end unemployment whatsoever. It is a plan to transition people to a just transition to good paying jobs. It's about frontline communities and making sure that historically marginalized Black and brown communities that typically bear the brunt of climate injustice are taken care of first and foremost. And these are the ideas, these are the notions that need to be talked about thoroughly if people are going to buy in and realize why they actually should come out to the vote and not stay home like millions of Americans did in 2016.
Sandra and I have talked some on this show. I think you've seen some of it about media bias and how it pertains to Senator Sanders' campaign. I mean, what's your explanation for why he gets left out of the headlines, why he's not subject to some of the glowing praise that other candidates are at times? Why do you think there's a blind spot there?
I do think that some of it is this notion that folks are looking for what is perceived as sexy and exciting, right? What's new? Now, we, as I have mentioned, have some pretty new policy programs, so the novelty there doesn't seem to be enough. But I think that there is a sort of thinly veiled contempt for the notion that Bernie Sanders has been saying the same thing for 30 years. You hear reporters say, oh, well, Bernie Sanders just repeats the same old stump speech, and that's a criticism. But when you talk to the people who support Senator Sanders, people who are kind of new to him even and hear him at his rallies, what they say is, wow, it's really heartening to hear someone who was right about these issues 30 years ago, who was a clarion call about climate change back when people were still laughing him out of the room. Even in 2016, he was laughed at the debates for saying the #1 international safety concern was climate change, right? And now when asked at the last debate, everyone on the stage basically gave that same answer, right? So I think that's a little bit of it. I think that also, there is, a disconnect between the interests that he is attacking, the interests that his policies seek to unsettle because they're antithetical to the interests of the American people and the people who fund the institutions that are running a lot of the corporate media. So it's not about individual journalists saying, I'm going to make this decision, but it's about a kind of cultural bias at these institutions and an institutional bias that trickles down. We're all familiar with how institutional bias works. So it's not about individual blame, but it's something we all have to kind of actively push back against.
When you see it happening at organization after organization, it's a systemic issue, not an individual journalist issue. Briahna, thank you. Good luck tonight.
Thanks, Briahna.
Thank you.
Next on Rising, Hill TV's Jamal Simmons. He's in Houston for the Democratic debate.
He's going to set the scene for us and share a preview of the big night when Rising returns.